Welcome to part 7 in my series of refutations of the arguments brought up by Sam Jeppy and the KRS channel against using the tropical zodiac in Vedic astrology, especially with sidereal nakshatras. So this is the 7th part. In part 1, I explained that the appeal to tradition, though far from a logical argument, is a very effective emotional technique for demonizing your opponent and stirring emotions against him. In part 2, I explained that the historical instability of Western astrology isn't some sort of a sign of its inferiority, but it's directly a cause of the social and religious instability in the Western world that arose as a result of these new radically different religions, Christianity, followed by Islam. In part 3, I demonstrated that the sidereal zodiac is in fact not the constellations themselves. And I did this by showing the borders of the constellations themselves and comparing them to the borders of the sidereal signs. In part 4, I explained that the reason why people have such a hard time conceiving of nakṣatras being separated from rashis is simply because they were taught that nakṣatras are intrinsically related to the rashis and the navamsha. If they were instead taught about the nakṣatras in the same way that the Vedas themselves teach about them, which is that the nakṣatras are the abodes of various gods, then they would not have such a strong resistance to this idea. In part 5, I corrected the misinformation that the tropical zodiac is more earthly than the sidereal, and the mistaken idea that karma is not earthly. In part 6, which is a particularly important part, I demonstrated how everything about the character and definition of a rashi or a sign is directly related to how that sign relates to the 4 cardinal points established by the equinoxes and solstices. And so in this part 6, I substantiated my controversial claim that the zodiac is inherently tropical. Now, here in part 7, I'm going to deal in detail with the historical argument, especially the claim that the zodiac was originally sidereal and was later changed to tropical by the Greeks, especially Ptolemy. Siderealists assert that the oldest form of the zodiac was sidereal, and later it became tropical. Well, the measure of any account of history is how well it incorporates all the available facts. This siderealist interpretation of history does not take into account all the historical facts. It either ignores or overlooks the facts which show that even the very oldest known systems of astrology contain the seed form of both sidereal and tropical approaches. Now, in case you haven't been following every part of this series, let me at this point just reiterate that sidereal is a word which means literally in reference to the stars, and tropical is a word which literally means in reference to the sun's 4 cardinal points. In the oldest records of astrology, we find the seeds of both. As for sidereal astrology, we find the seeds of it in the ancient records of predictions that people made by looking up at the stars. And by looking up at the stars, they then began to group these stars into constellations based on either how the moon moved through them or how they rose before the sun. And then after grouping them, they associated deities with the various constellations to give the meaning and the symbolic content of each constellation. So as a result, the various cultures developed various groups of constellations along the ecliptic. We have records of 28 from the Vedic culture and the Chinese culture as well, 36 from the Egyptian culture called Decans, and 18 from the Babylonians. So that's the seed of the sidereal approach. As for the seed of the tropical approach, we find the seeds of this undeniably in the fact that all ancient cultures very carefully observed the sun's movement in reference to 4 cardinal waypoints, the 2 equinoxes and 2 solstices. In Indian history, for example, the Aitreya Brahmana and Shatapatha Brahmana 418 in Aitareya and 462 in Shatapatha describe how carefully Vedic culture observed the equinoxes and solstices and arranged all the days in between. And these books are very old. They're dated linguistically to between 500 and 1000 BCE, or astrologically they seem to be between 1000 and 2000 BCE on a conservative side. So these are very old Vedic books showing how important the sun's movement through the 4 waypoints, the 4 tropos, the 4 tropics, was to Vedic culture. The Vedanga Jyotish, which is also quite old, it's commonly dated between 700 and 1500 BCE. It also carefully keeps track of the location of the equinoxes. Outside of India, you have Babylonia was a real hotbed of astrological development. In Babylonia, the old surviving record of their astronomy is Mul Apin. In that book, in 1.3, 1 through 12, you'll hear about the 4 cardinal points. They divided the sun's orbit into 360 parts with 12 sections of 30 parts each, and that they anchored this measurement system to the equinoxes and solstices, so that the equinoxes would fall in the middle of the 7th and 1st divisions. In fact, in every culture of the world, you'll find that they divided the sun's path into 12 equal segments based on the equinoxes and solstices. And if you look around at the surviving structures that we have from ancient times, like Stonehenge, the Sphinx, and the Mesoamerican pyramids, these are testaments to how important the measurements of the equinoxes and solstices were in ancient cultures across the globe. So the fact is that we see the seeds of both sidereal and tropical systems side by side in all the ancient major astrological cultures. And this makes the claim that astrology was originally sidereal very, very doubtful. The conclusion, which is more consistent with the facts, is that astrology has always been based on both sidereal and tropical considerations. Our oldest records of astrology are from a time, which is about 3,000 to 6,000 years ago, when we lacked the mathematical science to know where planets were when we couldn't see them. So at that time, astrologers relied entirely on interpreting what they could see directly in the sky. Now, they all had a system of 12 divisions of the sun's orbit based on solstices and equinoxes, which is the seed form of the tropical zodiac. But this system is measured by the ebb and flow of sunlight. Now, sunlight prevents us from seeing the stars and planets. And since we weren't able to know where those things were when we couldn't see them, we could not initially use the 12-fold system in astrological interpretations. That's why the very early forms of astrology were much more involved with observing stellar things they could see directly at night. And that's why people jumped to the conclusion that the original form of astrology was sidereal. But we find that because of astrology, actually mathematics evolved. And as the mathematics evolved and the astronomy evolved, we come to a point about 2,500 years ago where we started to become able to fairly accurately know where planets were when we couldn't see them. With the advent of these mathematical tools, the 12-fold division of the sun's orbit suddenly became greatly important in astrological interpretation and caused a revolution in how astrology was done. There was a huge revolutionary break between how astrology was done previous to this evolution of mathematics and how it was done after this evolution in mathematics. Previous to that, everything was based on observation directly of planets against the stars. After it, everything became based on calculations of the planets in these 12 abstract divisions of the sun's orbit. The culture which seems to have done this revolutionary step first was Babylonia. And they adopted this 12-fold system with such zeal that they actually reorganized their 18 sidereal constellations into 12 constellations to match the 12-fold division of the sun's path. Now, very soon after this, you have Alexander the Great, whose conquests put a huge portion of the earth under a common language, Greek. This facilitated really rapid cultural intermixing. And at that time, Egyptian and Babylonian astrology mingled and became what is now called Hellenistic astrology, which for the first time crystallized the planet, house, sign paradigm that we use as the foundation of astrology even to this very day. Now, much of the claim that the zodiac was originally sidereal is based on this fact that the Babylonians reorganized their 18 constellations into 12 to match the 12-fold zodiac. So it seems that they translated these 12 divisions of the sun's orbit into stellar phenomena, and therefore they made them a sidereal thing. This claim, however, ignores a few absolutely essential facts. First of all, it ignores that the entire basis of the 12 divisions in the first place is not stellar. The entire basis of the 12 divisions is the sun's movement through its 4 cardinal points. The second thing that this claim ignores is that each of the 12 divisions has its own individual character as a result of its ruler, elemental quadruplicity, and modal triplicity. And as I demonstrated in the previous installment, part 6, all 3 of these factors derive entirely from the sign's relationship to the 4 cardinal points established by the equinoxes and solstices. And the third fact that this claim has to ignore is that no one, including the Babylonians, yet had any clue that there was even such a thing as sidereal in contrast to tropical. It would be a few centuries between the time that the 12-fold zodiac became utilized due to the evolution of math, between that point and the point that people started to realize that there's a difference between sidereal and tropical versions of this 12-fold zodiac, is a period of a few centuries. So to claim that anyone previous to that discovery that there's a difference between sidereal and tropical, to claim that such a person at that time was using a sidereal zodiac as if it was in contrast to a tropical zodiac is extremely misleading. A far more reasonable understanding of the historical data is that the Babylonians, not knowing of equinoctial precession as nobody did at that time, drew an equivalence between the 12 signs and specific stars because the mathematics, which was allowing them to know where planets were when they couldn't see those planets, was still very young and inaccurate and needed to be fact-checked on occasion. So by referencing the 12-fold solar divisions to the stars, they could then, on occasion, whenever the planets became visible in the night sky, fact-check that their calculations were correct. The person commonly credited as being the first person to realize that there's a distinction between sidereal and tropical definitions of the zodiac, the first person to realize that the stars don't maintain a constant position in reference to the equinox of the sun, that person is Hipparchus, a Greek who lived in the 2nd century BCE. It's only after this discovery that the difference between sidereal and tropical zodiacs became a subject for debate or contemplation. Upon learning of Hipparchus' discovery, the majority of astronomers and astrologers decided to adopt the version of the zodiac that's anchored to the equinoxes and solstices, which is extremely reasonable because, as I previously explained, the equinoxes and solstices had been the foundation for this 12-fold division all along. Ptolemy, who is a contemporary of Hipparchus, was the first surviving author to explicitly accept this view, the tropical definition, in contrast to the sidereal. Now, Ptolemy did introduce many new concepts, such as the very untenable idea that planets have a direct causal influence on individual human life, and the concomitant idea that weather is a part of that chain of cause and effect of how planets affect us. However, any claim that Ptolemy invented the tropical zodiac or changed it from sidereal to tropical is highly suspect in consideration of all the historical facts I've presented so far. Now, after Hipparchus' discovery, eventually almost everyone accepted a tropical definition of the zodiac. But to be sure, in the early centuries of the Common Era, there was a bit of confusion and contention amongst important early astrologers like Vedic Phalans and others. But within a few centuries of this contention and confusion, the non-tropical definition of the zodiac became extremely rare and eventually died out almost entirely until the 20th century, when it was revived for a minority by a person named Cyril Fagan. However, a huge exception to this history was India. As soon as we speak of India or Indian culture, we're immediately drawn to its roots, which are founded in the ancient culture based on the body of knowledge known as Veda. The Veda describes itself as a transmission of perfect knowledge from Vishnu to Brahma, which is then disseminated throughout the ages until everyone by a system known as parampara. So this gives rise to the feeling or the attitude or the conception that Vedic knowledge is perfect and there is no need for improvement. The ancient sages who codified the Vedic knowledge perfectly understood everything entirely, and there's no chance for flaw or mistake. Now, it may surprise you, but I agree with this. I certainly agree with this. But it should be noted carefully that this very same Veda also says that it is perfectly understood only in the first age, Satya Yuga. It's partially understood in the second age, Treta Yuga. It's misunderstood in the third age, Dwapara Yuga. And it's incomprehensible in the fourth age, Kali Yuga, which is our age. Only the elucidations of the Veda created by Vyas, specifically for the people of this age, those are the only Vedic literatures which can be perfectly understood in our modern age. These begin with the Brahma Sutra, which is barely comprehensible to our modern minds. But then Vyasa improved on it, made it more comprehensible in the Mahabharata, and then he perfected it in Srimad Bhagavatam, which is described as Nigamakalpa Tarur Kalitam Palam, the ultimate fruit of the Nigamakalpa, the tree of the Vedas. So we have 3 books on which we can rely to perfectly understand the Veda in Kali Yuga. And the interesting part for astrologers is that nowhere in any of these, nor in any part of any surviving fragment that we have of the Vedas, is there any description whatsoever of Jataka Hora, which means natal horoscopic astrology. The kind of astrology where you have 12 houses, 12 signs, 7 planets, 9 planets, and it's calculated for a specific individual. That is not mentioned anywhere in the Vedas, etc., nor in Brahma Sutra, nor in Mahabharata, nor in Srimad Bhagavatam. So there is no grounds whatsoever for the elitist, there is no need for improvement attitude to creep into Indian astrology. There is no grounds for the idea that Indian astrology is not entirely subject to evolution, flaw, and improvement. Now, some may raise a question, isn't the Vedanga Jyotish a part of the Veda? The Vedanga Jyotish is an appendix to the Veda, and it does deal with astrological calculations and astronomy, but it absolutely does not contain any horoscopic or natal astrology whatsoever. And from the very beginning, it very clearly and explicitly introduces itself as astrology explicitly meant for calculating the proper time to perform the various rites and rituals of Vedic culture. The oldest Indian text that clearly and explicitly describes horoscopic natal astrology, is from the 2nd century of the Common Era, and it's called Yavana Jataka. This title literally means the natal divination system of the Ionians, which is a term for Greeks. So this book is literally titled The Astrology of the Greeks. And this is the first book in India that we have a record of which describes horoscopic natal astrology. Now, this definitely strongly suggests that natal horoscopic astrology came to India from the Greeks. And in fact, much of the key terminology that we still use in Vedic astrology today is entirely Greek and is not Sanskrit at all. For example, these important terms like Kendra and Kona. Now, as soon as we bring up this point, a lot of people get hot. A lot of people get upset and are going to accuse us of being ethnocentric and supporting an Aryan invasion type of view of Indian culture. But this is just an overreaction. The evidence simply shows that horoscopic astrology came to India from outside of India. There's no need to feel insulted about this. Horoscopic astrology is nothing but a trifle compared to what India truly, undoubtedly did accomplish through their Vedic culture, which is an understanding of the nature of reality and the source of reality and the individual's direct experience of and participation with that source. This matter is so much more important than astrology and is undoubtedly the jewel of India. In comparison to this, astrology is nothing. In fact, astrology attains the height of its usefulness only when it's enriched by the philosophical framework presented by the Vedas or by some modern derivation or dilution of that. As in the West, the Indian tradition clearly, explicitly, and unequivocally defines the zodiac in tropical terms, which means anchored to the solstices and equinoxes. This is nobody's opinion. It's just right there in black and white in the Puranas and Surya Siddhanta, and even in the work of the great 5th and 6th century Indian astronomer and mathematician Aryabhatta. See, for example, Aryabhatiya 4.1. And also, as in the West, the Indian tradition seems to have gone through some contention and confusion in the early centuries of the Common Era regarding which definition of the zodiac to accept, the tropical one or the sidereal one. The texts that we have that were written during these early centuries demonstrate this. For example, in the 6th century, the great Indian mathematician and astrologer Varaha Mihira, he wrote in Brihat Samhita 3:1-3 that the northern solstice used to be in Ashlesha. He's referring to Vedanga Jyotish, which notes the northern solstice in Ashlesha. And then he says, so we have to observe, take note of where the current location of the solstices and equinoxes are if we will know where Cancer and Capricorn actually begin. And then in Pancha Siddhantaka, another book which he wrote in the 3rd chapter, 21 and 32, he explains there that the equinoxes and solstices gradually move through the nakṣatras, so that the correlation between the two constantly requires correction. But interestingly, he said that astrologers in India were not doing this. And instead, he said they were just following tradition. So the difference between India and the rest of the world in the earlier centuries of the Common Era is that while the rest of the world resolved to accept the tropical zodiac, India resolved to accept the sidereal. It's obvious that the Indians knew about equinoctial precession, the difference between the tropical and sidereal framework. The Puranas definitely acknowledge axial precession and even utilize it to measure the passing of time. See, for example, the Srimad Bhagavatam 12:2, 27, and 28. And also, the very concept of Ayanangsha itself shows for certain that the Indians were aware that there's a difference between the equinox and the sidereal counterpart. So they did know about axial precession or equinoctial precession, but they chose the sidereal zodiac. So why? Why did they do that? One reason may be the essential nature of Indian culture itself. Because India has its roots in the Veda, it has developed as a culture which is intent on preserving something special. So it is developed as a very traditional, conservative culture in a sense. Because of this, you'll find that India is the world's foremost preserver of culture. That's why you can look to Indian culture very easily to find out about the gods. And people even will study Norse mythology by studying Vedic mythology. And you can look to Indian culture to find out about astrology, classical astrology. People can know about Hellenistic astrology by studying Vedic astrology. Because India is very good at preserving culture. So it has a very traditional nature to it. This is what Varaha Mihira pointed to when he said that the equinoxes are moving, but nobody's paying attention to that. They're only paying attention to tradition. It seems that the Indians wanted to keep things the way their teachers had taught them, the way their forefathers had used. So if the forefathers and the teachers put Ashvini at the beginning of Aries, which is where it was when this 12-fold natal astrology came into India, then why should we change that? We shouldn't change that. And that's why they wound up with the Sidereal Zodiac. Another reason why India resolved to the Sidereal Zodiac may have been that they integrated that 12-fold Zodiac with their Sidereal nakṣatras so tightly and quite compellingly that they refused to break that integration. They've refused to discard what they had achieved by allowing the nakṣatra to drift in relation to the Rashi. For whatever actual reason, the Indian astrologers did wind up accepting a sidereal zodiac. And that has to be described as a mistake, as hard as it is for a traditional culture to hear that their ancestors made a mistake. We have to describe it as a mistake because it contradicts how the Puranas and Surya Siddhanta define the zodiac, and how the 12-fold divisions of the sun's orbit had been originally conceived in Vedic India. And it's for this reason that people have periodically attempted to bring Indian astronomy and astrology to a tropical conception, independent of their doubtlessly sidereal nakṣatra. We find this even in early astrologers or astronomers like Varaha Mihira and Aryabhatta. But let's look at recent history. In recent times, an increasing number of voices have spoken in favor of adopting the tropical zodiac more fully in the context of Indian astrology, and I will let you know about those who I am aware of. In the late 19th century, S.B. Dikshita, in his book History of Indian Astronomy, in the second part, he concluded that the Indian calendar should be based on tropical zodiac signs, not sidereal. This is in the late 18th century, and this is S.B. Dikshita. He said that it should be based on tropical because of the importance of the solstices and equinoxes in Vedic religion. Dikshita recognized the unlikeliness of the conservative Indian culture accepting such a radically different view. So he suggested a partial reform, a compromise, which would be to standardize a single sidereal zodiac based on the Chitrapaksha and Amsha. Then we have the Official Calendar Reform Committee, led by N.C. Lahiri and commissioned by the Indian government in 1950. This committee exactly echoed Dikshit's recommendations. The first and second recommendation in the committee's official report was that the tropical reckoning should be used, and the start of the year, and thus the zodiac, should be the northerly equinox. This is the first and second recommendation in the Official Calendar Reform Committee commissioned by the Indian government in 1950. But in that second resolution, they conceded that an ayanamsha can be applied, quote, for religious purposes, as, quote, as a concession to the prevailing customs. Then again, on page 7 of that report, when they're elaborating on the standardization of the religious calendar, the committee writes, this recommendation, which refers to Chitrapaksha and Amsha, this recommendation is to be regarded only as a measure of compromise, so that we avoid a violent break with the established custom. But it does not make our present seasons in the various months as they were in the days of Varaha Mihira or Kalidas. So it is hoped, they wrote, that at not a distant date, Further reforms for locating the lunar and solar festivals in the seasons in which they were originally observed will be adopted. So I doubt very much that the Calendar Reform Committee members would be giving thumbs down on my videos and sending me hate mail. But in any case, it's clear that the 7 extremely highly esteemed scientists and scholars who were commissioned for that committee agreed that the tropical zodiac was correct. But a sidereal zodiac would be required to accommodate prevailing custom. Thus, they viewed the sidereal zodiac as a compromise with tradition. In 1930, a little before that, someone named G.V. Krishnaswamy published a paper entitled Reform of the Indian Calendars. In this paper, he says, quote, "The method of placing the ayanas and the months on a sidereal basis in the Indian calendars is defective, and hence there is a difference of about 23 days in the calculations." As we come to more modern times, there are at least 3 scholars that I know of, Krishan Kaul, M.K.A. Patrakam, and T.V. Shivaraman, who speak very openly against the sidereal zodiac. And they have some significant support. Sri Swarupananda Saraswati Maharaj of Dwarkamat stands behind them. And he adds in his testimonial that the Dwarka Mutt has promoted the very same idea for 120 years. Sri Jayendra Saraswati Swamigal of Kanchi Mutt also supports them. And he says that, quote, "the time has come for this reform." Ganga Dharendra Saraswati Swamiji of Sri Sonda Swarnavali Mutt also supports them. And his testimonial says that all must, quote, "fall in line with the Sayana system." And for those who aren't familiar with the term, Sayana means tropical. So tropical reform in Indian astrology is therefore not at all a Western imposition on Indian culture, an Aryan invasion, an ethnocentric thing. But, however, Western astrologers have also supported this reform, particularly as it applies to interpretive natal horoscopic astrology. The first Westerner recognized for doing so is Ernst Wilhelm, who published his first paper on the subject in 2006. Another astrologer named Ryan Kurzak adopted Ernst's system a few years later and often explains it and is quite an important astrologer. In 2012, I also adopted tropical Rashi, but with a standardized Chitrapaksha nakṣatra. And I've been vocal in explaining this, particularly during this year, 2017, in response to this system coming under heavy criticism and ignorant criticism, as a result of it gaining a lot more traction and support and momentum amongst a wider group of practicing astrologers. So there you have a history of the zodiac from very ancient times up till very modern times. And I hope that you'll carefully consider these interpretations of the historical facts, because they take all the historical facts into account much more fully than the siderealist argument of history does. Thank you very much for your attention, and we have 2 more parts left to do after this. Thank you. Please subscribe or whatever you need to do so that you can not miss those parts and all the other videos that I'm going to do after we're done with this sidereal tropical stuff. Thank you so much.